Hello, my name is Mallory Jenna Robinson. Join me on A Hateful Homicide, a true crime podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders of transgender, gender non-binary, and gender diverse community members in the United States and abroad. This is A Hateful Homicide.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah. A transgender woman has been shot and killed in North Baltimore. Alpha?
In the U.S., trans women of color have a life expectancy of just 35 years.
This happens on a daily. Another one of my friends got killed right up the street from here.
These cases are true. The victims are real, and their voices matter. This is A Hateful Homicide. The murder of Chynal Lindsey, just past midnight. Saturday, June 1st, 2019, Dallas, Texas. Warning, the following episode you're about to listen to will contain audio evidence of misgendering. Listening discretion is advised.
Last hour, Dallas police, the chief going on record saying that a body that was pulled from White Rock Lake over the weekend was that of a transgender woman. That is now the second murder of a transgender in a month.
And a sense of concern in the city's black transgender community. Robbie Owens live at police headquarters with the top story at 5. Robbie?
Well, Gilman and Doug, Chief Hall telling us just moments ago that the department is now calling in the FBI to assist in investigating these murders, that of Malaysia Booker just a couple of weeks ago and of the body found in White Rock Lake just this weekend.
Well, we are investigating that as a homicide at this time.
Is there evidence backing that, or are you just doing that?
Obvious signs of homicidal violence is what we found.
The chief is asking everyone to take a look at this picture. Born Jason Hazlitt, she was known in the transgender community as Chynal Lindsey. A passerby spotted her body in White Rock on Saturday. Police today now confirming they are investigating 4 unsolved murders of black transgender women dating back to 2015. Another was assaulted but survived. Now, Chief Hall today stopped short of saying the department is dealing with a serial killer, but those in the transgender community are clearly afraid. I spoke with Jasmine today, who attended this press conference. I asked her if acceptance was what she was seeking.
Nah, do I gotta ask to be human? I'm born, I'm human, I'm in the flesh like y'all. I'm just asking to respect me and to don't bother me in my everyday life if I'm not messing with you or doing anything. I'm not asking or forcing myself on anybody. I'm just trying to be me.
Telling me she just wants to be heard. That community, though, clearly afraid. Some in that community feel that there is a serial killer targeting this community. Chief Hall today saying another reason that she wants the FBI to assist with this case is that she acknowledged the lack of resources in the department, that they are down some 500 officers from where they were some years ago. There are lots of questions, lots of answers that need to be provided, and she believes that the FBI will be able to provide this community some of those answers, specifically related to a motive and whether these murders are hate crimes. Of course, we will continue to follow this developing story.
It's Saturday, June 1st, 2019, in the city of Dallas, Texas. It would be the home where 26-year-old African-American transgender female Chynal Lindsey would reside. And on that Saturday, when she disappeared and her family couldn't get a hold of her, they became suspicious. However, around the same time as they became alarmed of her Saturday afternoon disappearance, they realized that they weren't the only ones who were worried. A passerby by the name of Calvin Torrance was out at White Rock Lake in Dallas, along with his 2 boys. They were out having a good time and enjoying themselves, when all of a sudden, Calvin spotted something in the lake, floating up And as he and his boys went closer to the lake, what they discovered will leave the city of Dallas devastated for years to come. Welcome, my audience. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of A Hateful Homicide. This episode is entangled with attraction, lust, identity, you name it, and ultimately murder. This case really includes just a lot of self-discovery within Chynal's journey. Learning about her and learning about her life has been such an incredible privilege. And today's episode is going to talk about, just the identity of the perpetrator, 22-year-old cisgendered male Ruben Alvarado, and then also just the trial as well as remarks from loved ones, especially that of cousin and family spokesperson Chynal Lindsey. So my audience, we're going to go ahead and jump in and get into this episode, season 13, episode 11, Just Past Midnight, the murder of Chynal Lindsey. So again, it all began if we go back to Cinco de Mayo of 2019. 22-year-old cisgendered Latino male Ruben Alvarado met 26-year-old African-American transgender female Chynal Lindsey on a dating app. The two had hit it off, found each other to be mutually attractive, and began a series of conversations. Those conversations entailed just day-to-day of just how are you, I would like to get to know you, spend some time with you in person. And from what we understand, Chynal and Ruben had met once before. However, there wasn't a sexual component to their first encounter, nothing more than like just a little bit of kissing. However, the second encounter, which occurred just past midnight on that Saturday, June 1st of 2019, that would be where everything would begin to unfold. Ruben, who was entranced by Chynal and her beauty and her brilliance, he was ready to meet up with her again. The two who had already met up around Cinco de Mayo, he was enthusiastically messaging her, and he had called her just past midnight on June 1st. And the two were going to meet up in his red Ford Explorer and go to his apartment back over in Mesquite, Texas, which is where he was from. So they had already made these arrangements to meet up with each other and connect. And so just past midnight, Ruben Alvarado calls Chynal Lindsey. She comes out of her home. The call lasts for about 40 seconds, and they head over to White Rock Lake. And this should have been an innocent, young adult encounter between two consenting adults who were attracted to each other. That is how it should have occurred. However, what happens next will leave yourself as well as even me speechless. Well, this all is unfolding. The events is going to be leading up. Ruben discovers, according to him, that Chynal identifies as a transgender woman. Then he attacks her with a blunt force object, beats her throughout her entire body, and then he takes his belt from off of his pants after he's beat her into unconsciousness, takes his belt and wraps it around her neck, dumping her body into White Rock Lake, all just past midnight on June 1st of 2019. So by that afternoon of that Saturday, June 1st, 2019, Chynal's family, who had not heard from her since that early morning hours when she left off, immediately became alarmed because of the fact that this was not like her. This was not like this 26-year-old vivacious transgender female who was just full of life and had so much going for her in Dallas, Texas. And so again, all of this is starting to unfold while Chynal's family is beginning to become alarmed and contemplating if they should file a missing persons report. Calvin Torrance, a 41-year-old cisgendered male, and his two sons were out at White Rock Lake by 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. Several hours had passed since Ruben Alvarado had committed the hateful homicide of Chynal Lindsey. He had plenty of time to leave the scene of the crime, where it was in the pitch black of night, besides his headlights gleaming as he drove away, leaving Chynal's body to float to the bottom of the lake. However, by that afternoon, when Calvin and his boys were out having a good Saturday fun day, what he noticed what he thought was a mannequin, my audience. He was a little concerned. So he and his oldest son, who was a teenager, wanted to make sure that if it was someone, that they weren't in distress. They go over, and when they discover Chynal's body, bloated and with a belt wrapped around her neck, it would leave them completely speechless. Calvin calls 911, and the Dallas Police Department is immediately rushed out to White Rock Lake. Detective Erica Page and Chief Renee Hall are the first two on the scene, trying to figure out exactly, first, the identity of this beautiful black trans female, not knowing her identity as there was no ID on her. What they would ultimately have to do is to get the forensics team in, which would include that of Greg Gambrell. They all would begin to do fingerprint analysis, as well as digital media analysis of the cell phone that was left along the embankment of the lake. So they assumed that this cell phone could have possibly been Chynal Lindsey's. And once they'd taken her body back to the Dallas coroner's office, where James Henry Hawkins, the coroner of Dallas, he went in and he ultimately described Chynal's injuries of those of strangulation and blunt force trauma throughout her entire body. Once the fingerprint analysis came back to that of 26-year-old transgender female Chynal Lindsey, her family was immediately notified. That included her mother and other relatives, leaving them completely blindsided and devastated. The family, who had kept in touch with Chynal, knew that they would hear from her periodically, and typically she would touch bases with them on Saturdays. So by that Saturday afternoon, when her mother had not heard from her, even though they didn't reside together, this was a cause for concern. And so again, now that you have James Henry Hawkins, the coroner, who has made a positive identity of that being Chynal Lindsey, Detective Erica Page and Chief Renee Hall goes to the home of Chynal's mother and makes that death notification, leaving that family completely devastated. And one of those family members who was completely devastated and became the family spokesperson was Tamaya Lindsey. Tamaya Lindsey would be a huge advocate for her cousin, always concerned for her safety, and recalled an incident or an event where they had saw each other, and she recalled being concerned if she was going to see Chynal again. And all of these things unfortunately led to the reality of them not being able to see the lovely Chynal back with them again. The family is devastated, distraught, and of course they want to know who murdered Chynal. And so Detective Erica Page and Chief Renee Hall were determined to get those answers. So they reach out to, again, that digital and media specialist and forensics team member, Gary Gambrell, and he was able to trace Chynal's phone to a phone number that had called her just past midnight on Saturday, just a few hours earlier before her body was discovered. And they were able to trace that number back to a cisgender male by the name of Ruben Alvarado of Mesquite, Texas. My audience, tracing Ruben would be easier said than done. It would take almost 3 weeks before Ruben would be apprehended. He would officially be arrested on June 20th of 2019, 3 weeks after the hateful homicide of Chynal Lindsey. But before all of this was discovered, right, they were still wanting the family of Chynal Lindsey wanted answers. They wanted to know who was responsible for this hateful homicide. Again, they were, still trying to figure out, wrapping their head around the fact that Chynal was no longer going to be coming home. She wasn't going to be making those Saturday phone calls. And so they were seeking justice and wanting to know who killed their cousin, who killed their daughter, who committed this hateful homicide. And so they were seeking answers and seek the media's help for that.
Woman found dead in White Rock Lake is now urging anybody with information to please come forward. Her murder is now the third in just 8 months involving transgender women. Only on CBS 11, the victim's family spoke to our Andrea Lucia. Andrea is joining us live tonight at Dallas's White Rock Lake. Andrea.
Yeah, Doug, a cousin I spoke to said she had been worrying about the victim. She says for the past year, her family hasn't known where she's been living or even how to contact her. But she says one thing is certain: Chynal Lindsey was loved. And the discovery of her body here on White Rock Lake has devastated family members who'd already lost her once before.
He was one of those people, to know him is something. To know him would be to love him.
After nearly a lifetime apart, Chynal Lindsey says she was reunited 5 years ago with her cousin Jason, who'd been placed for adoption as a young child.
He was just smiling. He was just so excited to see us.
He lived with her and other family members, but after a while, she says he began to struggle with drugs and moved out. It was around the same time, she says, her cousin began identifying as a trans woman, taking the name Chynal Lindsey.
This is him when he came into the store.
Several months ago, her cousin visited her at work, meeting her co-workers.
And they were like, man, she loves you so much, and I just broke down and cried because I kept saying, I don't know if this is the last time that I'm going to see you.
It would be. Saturday, Dallas police say they recovered Chynal's body from White Rock Lake. There were signs, Chief Renee Hall said, of homicidal violence.
We are actively and aggressively investigating this case.
The department now has 4 unsolved murders involving transgender women, 3 within just the last year, and all of them African American. Tamaya is now left wondering who could have ripped her cousin out of her life again.
If this was a hate crime, shame on you.
These murders have members of the transgender community here in Dallas really frightened. I spoke to a trans woman who attended the Chief's press conference today to ask her personally what is being done. The Chief responded that police are working closely with leaders within the LGBT community to try to improve the safety.
And as you could hear, Chynal Lindsey, the cousin of Chynal, the family spokesperson, fondly recalled, Chynal being brought into their family, and times that they spent together, living together, the last encounter that they shared. And you could hear the angst and the heartache in her voice as she's still trying to wrap her head around the fact that Chynal has been abruptly taken away from them through the act of a hateful homicide. One of the things to my audience, as you could hear in the audio, was that there has been this question posed of a serial killer. There have been several Black trans women murdered brutally from April until about July of 2019 in the city of Dallas. And so because these murders were so in rapid succession, there was a question as to whether they were by the hands of the same individual. So again, was Ruben Alvarado responsible for all of the other hateful homicides of these other Black trans women? Was this his MO? Well, my audience, that is what we're going to find out. But before we do, I want to dive into a little bit more about Chynal Lindsey. Born in 1992, Chynal Lindsey was a native of Arlington, Texas, and described as someone who had an infectious smile, laugh, she loved to giggle. She was a huge lover of animals. Her favorite animals were bunnies and gerbils. And then she also was an aspiring mechanic. Yeah, you heard me correctly, an aspiring mechanic. Chynal loved cars, fast cars, and all types of cars. And so when she began her gender journey around 2016, just 3 years before her hateful homicide, at the age of 23, she was really empowered in her truth. She began her social journey and even began her medical journey. And though she was still finding her way through, in 2019, Chynal had so much to look forward to. She was looking forward to that summer. She was getting ready to plan, an incredible Pride event in Dallas. She wanted to attend, which would have been coming up as Pride season was beginning. She was also looking forward to just Father's Day and spending time with her loved ones for Father's Day, which was also coming up in June of 2019. So all of these things that she was looking forward to was abruptly ended. And again, she was very close to her cousin Chynal Lindsey, and they both shared quite the times together. And so again, this has just left the family completely devastated. And again, with all of these other beautiful Black trans women being murdered within several months of each other, and as we've covered before, we do have to wonder, was this the case of a serial killer? And the case in this case, my audience, is that no. They discovered that each of these Black trans women had been murdered by 4 different individuals, which is concerning within itself, because that means you have 4 cis men who went out and murdered 4 trans women just for being trans. And one of the things that Detective Erica King, as well as Chief Renee Hall wanted to understand was who was responsible for the murder of Chynal Lindsey. And again, once, their partner, Gary Gambrell, was able to give that digital and media evidence supporting the fact that Chynal Lindsey's last phone call, last series of text messages was all with Ruben Alvarado. He was really kind of, besides touching base with her family and her close friends, he was kind of that quote-unquote consistent partner that she had been communicating with from Cinco de Mayo, May 5th of 2019 until June 1st, that Saturday of her hateful homicide. And so they were able to also ping both Alvarado's phone and Lindsey's phone to White Rock Lake, showing that they were pinging there at the same time. And so once he was finally arrested on June 20th of 2019, Detective Erica King and Chief Renee Hall wanted to know what happened. And when they sat him down in the Dallas Police Department, what he revealed, again, completely dropped the jaws of these law enforcement agents. He shared with them that he was attracted to Chynal. He liked her. They hung out once before. They celebrated Cinco de Mayo together. They shared a few kisses, and then they kept in touch. He wanted to see where it could go, according to Ruben. And that's why he was so insistent on the meeting again. And when he reached out to her via phone just past midnight on Saturday, June 1st, 2019, for them to have a meet and greet, she, who had been also attracted to him and interested and found him to be very intriguing. He had a vehicle, he had his own place, so she felt that he was somewhat accomplished. Though he lived just about 30 miles east in Mesquite, she was definitely willing to go back again and spend some time with him. And so that's exactly what they planned to do. And so when he called, they shared a phone call for just 40 seconds, him confirming that he had made it outside of the home that she shared with roommates. She left, and then once they arrived to White Rock Lake in his red Ford Explorer, they got out, sat on the picnic tables, began to talk and make out, had a little heavy petty, when Chynal, according to him, disclosed her gender identity. And when she did, he became so enraged that he began to beat her with a blunt force object, again, throughout her entire body. And then again, once she was unconscious, he placed that belt around her neck and then tossed her body into White Rock Lake, fleeing, leaving her cell phone accidentally. He did admit that he had intended to take her cell phone, but he had accidentally dropped it and felt scared to go back and return the phone. So again, he was ultimately detained and placed on a $500,000 bail, and he remained in custody until Monday, November 8th of 2021, when he began trial. Prior to that, the jury selection in his case had begun, especially once, his identity had been revealed and a trial date had been identified. There had been some delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but again, things were ready to kickstart.
Community members across Dallas want people to remember Chynal Lindsey. All smiles here, but her tragic story is one that'll play out in a Dallas courtroom in the coming days. Jury selection is underway right now in the trial of Ruben Alvarado, the man accused of killing Lindsey in 2019. She's one of several black transgender women murdered in Dallas that year.
I think that for the family, it's going to provide a sense of closure as well as a sense of justice.
Naomi Green is an advocate who also handles transgender programming for a nonprofit in Dallas. She's among those who will be following Alvarado's murder trial. Lindsey's body was found in White Rock Lake back in June 2019. Court documents show Alvarado is accused of strangling, choking, and hitting the victim with fists, a belt, and other deadly weapons. Details still tough for many to hear.
It's not okay. It really reinforces that it's not okay to kill people for whatever reason, but especially not just for being trans and living in their truth and who they are.
Lindsey's case, along with Tiffany Thomas, Malaysia Booker, Mercy Mack, Coco Wortham, Kier Cartier, and others, are among those putting Dallas at the center of national attention for attacks or murders against transgender women or gender non-conforming people.
Some of their names and faces are etched in my brain and in my memory.
Advocates say more work needs to be done while pushing awareness and urging more allies to come forward. What message do you have, if any, for those members of our community who may be waiting and watching to see what happens during this trial this week?
Be patient. Let the justice system do what it is supposed to do. Understand that this is a step in the right direction.
And as you could hear, the jury selection had begun in the trial of Ruben Alvarado. At this point, he was now a 24-year-old cisgender Latino male. And the prosecutor for this trial and for this case was DA Melody Lewis. And she, was very determined. This was a really girl power team, of course, including Gary Gambrell. But these ladies worked tirelessly to assure the justice for our lovely Chynal Lindsey. And so when the trial began on that Monday, November 8th of 2021, prosecutor Melody Lewis, definitely laid out the fact that this was a first-degree felony hateful homicide. She argued the fact in trial that Ruben Alvarado lured Chynal Lindsey to her death, that he had become suspicious. According to some additional phone evidence, Ruben had started to discuss with some of his friends that he was a little suspicious of Chynal's gender identity, and so he was going to ultimately confront her and get some answers. And that is what he did. That Melody Lewis, DA Melody Lewis, argued was that he essentially wanted some answers, and once he got those answers from Chynal, then he began to viciously attack her, and then ultimately strangling her and dumping her body in White Rock Lake. So this was the argument that they were having. And then you also had his defense team, which was made up of pro bono attorneys by the name of Cynthia Thomas. And so she argued that Ruben had a panic. He was distressed that this wasn't first-degree murder, that it was at the very least manslaughter, that when he discovered that Chynal Lindsey was transgendered, that instead of leaving, as most people would logically do, he decided to attack her because he was worried that she was going to attack him. And we've heard this before in other cases, again, this trans panic defense. And this is exactly what Ruben Alvarado was doing. He and attorney Cynthia Thomas, they argue that Chynal Lindsey tricked Ruben into an intimate relationship, and that when he discovered her gender identity, that he ultimately reacted, losing all rationale and logic and resulting in, manslaughter, accidentally killing her. And once he had beat her into unconsciousness, he felt that he couldn't leave her alive in fear of her disclosing his name, right? They had these series of phone calls, they had these series of text messages, they had been linked to a dating app. So he knew that Chynal knew who he was, and therefore once he had attacked her in response to discovering her gender identity, he was left with no choice but to ultimately strangle her and dump her body in the lake. This is what attorney Cynthia Thomas argued, this defense for Ruben Alvarado in response to the hateful homicide of Chynal Lindsey. And DA Melody Lewis, my audience, continued to hammer home with the forensic evidence, with the digital evidence. They also was able to trace CCTV footage showing, fortunately Dallas is a city with incredible CCTV footage, like a lot of major cities, but they definitely have very clear and high definition CCTV footage. So they had Ruben Alvarado's 2015 Ford Explorer, red Ford Explorer, leaving the home of Chynal Lindsey. They could see it at different traffic stops, and you could see Chynal alive at that time, and you would also see them having these conversations. And then you could also, again, Melody Lewis argued the phone evidence, the fact that Ruben had been texting with his friends, that if he discovered that Chynal Lindsey was trans, that, he wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he was definitely going to, quote unquote, teach her a lesson, meaning that he had the premeditation to hurt her if she disclosed her gender identity. And when she did, that is what he did. Beat her into submission and then strangled her to death. And so again, this was argued as first degree malicious murder. And so you had this jury who was now left after a 2-week trial, ultimately left with a decision to make. And when they made their decision, which was a decision of guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to a sentence of 37 years to life in the Department of Texas Corrections, he, was irate. He, felt that he was the victim. When Chynal's family, especially her cousin Chynal Lindsey, confronted Ruben Alvarado during the victim impact, he wasn't remorseful. He, smacked his lips. He did all of that, my audience. He was very cavalier and blasé about it, as we've seen with a lot of the, the convicted killers of these beautiful trans and gender non-binary and gender non-conforming intersex community members that we've covered now for 3 seasons. And so unfortunately, Ruben, at this point, this 24-year-old cisgender Latino male, did not have any remorse for the hateful homicide of that of 26-year-old African-American transgender female Chynal Lindsey. And so my audience, again, this case is just really heartbreaking, because when you think of the promise that Chynal had, she wanted to go into to school for mechanics and become a mechanic, and she wanted to get into the car shows. And so all of these things were snuffed out by that Saturday just past midnight at White Rock Lake in Dallas, Texas. And so now again, we're just going to talk about the sentencing of Ruben Alvarado.
A transgender woman, after learning she was transgender, will spend 37 years behind bars. Ruben Alvarado was sentenced today for strangling and beating Chynal Lindsey, then dumping her body in White Rock Lake. She was found in the water in June of 2019. Her family today testified about the pain they'll now have to carry for the rest of their lives. Fox 4's Stephen Dye, live in Dallas tonight. Stephen.
Steve, as you mentioned, Ruben Alvarado was sentenced to nearly 40 years in prison after murdering Chynal Lindsey back in June of 2019. One of her family members did speak in the victim impact statements, and said that she forgave him.
But your choices put you in that seat. You gotta ride that horse now. You chose to be here. You chose to deal with what you deem as the wrong way.
More than than 2 years after 26-year-old Chynal Lindsey's body was pulled out of White Rock Lake, the man who admitted to killing her was sentenced to 37 years in prison. Earlier this week, Ruben Alvarado testified about what happened that night in June of 2019. He says he thought Lindsey was a cisgender woman. He intended to have sex with her at White Rock Lake, but when he realized she was transgender, he says he panicked, that they fought, and he called her the aggressor. Court documents say Alvarado used his belt to strangle Lindsey and dumped her body in the lake.
Think about how close you have to be to someone.
On Wednesday, the jury came to a unanimous verdict. Alvarado faced a maximum life sentence in prison. Instead, the jury recommended 37 years.
I forgive you. I know that my cousin would forgive you. Now you gotta work on forgiving yourself, because if not, those demons at night are nasty.
Tamaya Lindsey is Chynal's cousin. She read a letter from the victim's sister, who never got to see Chynal after she transitioned.
Not only have I had to mourn the loss of my big brother, but also the sister I always wanted.
Alvarado's defense wanted the jury to rule that he acted in sudden passion, meaning it was a crime provoked in the heat of the moment. The jury didn't buy it.
The pain and hurt that my family has to carry will never diminish. Hate crimes will not be tolerated.
Now, Chynal Lindsey's murder happened within weeks of another transgender woman being murdered. Now, these prompted responses from leaders in our community saying that trans women, especially black trans women, are marginalized, saying some resort to sex work to make ends meet, and frequent targets of hate crimes. Now, Governor Abbott was prompted to give a response after these murders, saying that he called them unacceptable.
Unacceptable, according to the governor of Texas, Governor Abbott. My audience, this case, as we slowly get ready to conclude, the last thing I'm going to share with you all. Again, you heard from Tamaya Lindsey in the courtroom as she spoke to Ruben Alvarado in that victim impact statement again. And even you could hear from Chynal's sister, who was just so devastated that she never got to really bond with Chynal as Chynal. So again, all of these hopes and dreams that they had for Chynal, all of these hopes and dreams that Chynal had for herself, are now gone. And this family, the Lindsey family, the Hadlick family, all of them are now left devastated and reeling from these series of events. Again, we're gonna take a moment and hear a little bit more from Tamaya Lindsey, the family spokesperson and cousin of Chynal Lindsey. She has truly been the voice for Chynal. And again, though there has been misgendering, it is all their way of loving. Again, we have to remember what people are sometimes and just know that despite the misgendering that has happened, that they loved Chynal, that she was their family member, regardless of their blood, and they are devastated by this, my audience. And so again, as you're going to hear from Chynal Lindsey, she did an interview with MTV, and she talked with an incredible anchor and talked really about the impact that Chynal's death has had on her family, but then also giving a little bit more insight into who Chynal was.
What does Chynal want to be?
This is gonna blow you away. A mechanic.
A mechanic. Damn, had a love for cars, always loved cars.
Yeah.
When did you find out Chynal had passed away?
So, I got a call from my aunt. And the detectives called her. She said they found Chynal in White Rock Lake. And I just said, well, what happened? And all they could tell me is homicidal violence. Is all they would tell me. So I don't know the reasoning for what happened. Every day I wonder. So when the detectives was telling me that, and I kept asking questions, and she couldn't really disclose a lot. She just was like, it's still under investigation, and it's a lot that we can't disclose.
What did you learn about the manner of death? What had happened?
They won't disclose it.
Had you heard about any other trans murders at this time, and did you think they were connected?
And that's what made me nervous. But just watching the news and stuff, I kind of thought it was like a serial thing. Because they get attacked all the time, especially here in Texas. They're not accepted.
So why do you think black trans women face this kind of violence so often?
I think that people who become involved in romantic relationships don't want folks to find out because those relationships are stigmatized. And rather than coming to terms with who they are, they turn to violence.
What were some of the things that made you think Chynal's murder might have been connected to Malaysia's?
The reporter was telling me that it had been a stream of transgendered people getting killed. She was like, you do know within the last couple of months, she makes the fourth one.
In Malaysia's case, they charged someone named Kendra Lyles. Had you ever heard of that name before? And did you think that Kendra might have been involved in Chynal's murder at all?
I don't know.
Who was eventually arrested and charged in Chynal's murder?
A guy named Ruben Alvarado. All I know is they have phone records. He drove almost an hour. They talked on the phone for less than 2 minutes. Within an hour, my cousin was in his car.
What conclusion did the community come to about what was going on here?
What's even more chilling about this is the idea that, no, it wasn't a serial killer. These are two unrelated murders, which means that this violence against trans women is even more widespread than the community may have thought at first.
This is so sad. I would wish this on my worst enemy, none of this.
No. But people don't pay attention until it happens to them, which is unfortunate.
And so, my audience, it is unfortunate. And as you could hear, yes, there was a string and series of black trans women being murdered in Dallas, Texas for quite a few months. And all of them were by the hands of different cisgendered men. We have to remember that black trans women are the most marginalized. As a black trans woman myself, I must encourage each and every one of you to listen to Chynal's story and the story of so many others. We are simply trying to live our lives. And as you can see, whether it's a community member who just wants to belong like Jasmine in the beginning of today's episode, or rather it's Chynal Lindsey who is sharing that their loved one who identified as trans is no longer here. All of these questions, all of these responses are pleas for the world to hear that enough is enough. We must do better. These beautiful beings, again, are human beings and their lives are being taken. So in conclusion, Chynal Lindsey, we remember you yesterday, today, tomorrow, forever and always. Born 1992 and resting on since June 1st of 2019. Thank you all so much, my audience, for tuning in to this episode of A Hateful Homicide, just past midnight. We have about 2 more episodes before our season finale and before we begin for season 4 in the fall. So again, thank you all so much for just your continued support. Please check out our website at hatefulhomicide.net. Take a listen on Apple and Spotify podcasts. And again, please continue to use the hashtags A Hateful Homicide, Trans Awareness, True Crime, Say Their Name, Investigative Journalism, and Suspenseful Saturdays. Again, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and please have a good day. Bye-bye.